This is the latest in Mr. B's Shop and Science page. I have 3 construction classes this year that I'm teaching at Eunice High School, and we've been discussing lumber. As we all know, lumber comes from trees. Here in the western United States, most of the lumber that we use is what we call softwood, usually processed from pine or fir trees. And in our case, the lumber that we get in southeastern New Mexico can come from anywhere from Georgia to Florida to Washington State, Idaho, East Texas, no telling where it's coming from. But we have several different kinds of wood that we want to talk about and some of the characteristics of each. First of all, anything that looks like this, where it's very thin, wide, or just very thin, these are boards. These are the 1x pieces of material, 1 inch thick, however many inches wide, and then however many inches long. These are boards, technically. And this happens to be my board foot here. This is how lumber and timber products are measured in raw material. A board foot simply is a piece of wood that's 12 inches across, 12 inches long, and 1 inch thick. And this one's not quite a complete board foot, but it's very close, and it allows you to visualize when we're talking about buying lumber in board feet. This is what we're talking about. Okay. Here's another board right here. Now this one, if you'll notice, is not as smooth as this one. This one is a piece of what we call rough cut material. Rough cut means you can tell it's been run through the saws, but it hasn't been sanded. This one is actually closer to 1 inch in thickness, as you can see. When we sand a piece of material off, we take the outer layers off, it actually gets thinner. But this is rough, so it's actually closer to the dimensions that we would think. In this case, this is a 1x6. When we sand a piece of material down, we call this a finished piece of lumber. And finished lumber can be sanded on top and bottom, or on 2 sides, or it can be sanded all the way around or sanded on 4 sides. And in this particular case, we'll talk about the problems with this poor little piece of wood in just a minute. As we get thicker, these are the 2x pieces of material. Anything larger than 2 inches thick, this is called dimension lumber. Yes, a board is a piece of dimension lumber also, but generally speaking, this is a board, and then this is a piece of something different. This could be, if I were to put this under a floor, this is a joist. If I put this into a ceiling, this becomes a rafter. If I use this in construction, it might be something that's weight-bearing. This takes on different names depending on where we're using it in construction. Okay. I'll point to this one over here in the back corner. Let me see if you can see him. Yes, you can. This one here. This is called a 4x4. And once you get larger than about 8x8, 8 inches by 8 inches, or 10x10, then we start, depending on where you're at, they call them timbers. It just depends on where you're at and what the local lingo is in your lumber store. Okay, so when you go in, what are you looking for? Well, let's talk about defects in lumber material. The first thing you want to look for is you want to look at the end of your piece of wood. If you look at this, you can see right here, that is the heart of the tree, right there. And in 100 years ago, heartwood was a very desirable product because heartwood came with very few defects. But that's also because the tree was 300 or 400 years old and it had a chance to grow. Today, most of the lumber that we get in our lumber store is 2nd or 3rd or 4th generation trees that have been grown on tree farms. The problem with this is, in this case, this was a very young tree. These spots that you see here, we call these knots. They're very super dense pieces of material, organic material. This was where, and you can see it kind of right there, this is where the branches were growing from the center or the heart of the tree. And this one has got quite a few. You can see where they've cut across the knots right here. This is an undesirable piece of wood unless it's just for something like making into a shelf or something like that. But if I had to work this piece of wood, it would be very difficult because every knot would pose a problem. I could bend nails, I could dull out my saw blades. Not a desirable thing at all. Plus, the heartwood, this is where when we release the tension on all this pent-up energy that's been held together very tightly, it wants to come apart. Case in point. This piece of wood right here is a 1x10. This piece of wood, you can tell, comes out of the heart of the wood. If you look down the middle of this, right above the D and to the right of the 9, where that little crack is, you can see there's no lines. Well, this is where the wood is going to split naturally all by itself because it's the weakest part of the tree anymore. And while we're here, these lines that are in the wood, here's a better piece of wood right here. These lines, this is called the grain of the wood. When somebody's talking about the grain, we want the grain to go long ways down the piece of wood. We want the lines to be very tightly packed going across the piece of wood because each one of these is then a piece of wood laying down by the next one, and then we're distributing the weight across the top of it, and that makes this a very strong piece of wood. Now, let's compare this to this. In this case, these growth rings, here's the center of the piece of the tree. These growth rings have had a chance to grow very quickly. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. This tree was 18 years old at least when it was cut. But there's at least more than that right here on this piece of wood. This, if you can get the grains going diagonally, that's also a strong piece of wood. We like this, where it makes a 90-degree turn. Yep, right there, 90 degrees. We also like them going diagonally across. But this is considered to be coarse-grained. The rings are wide apart. Oh, and in speaking of tree rings, here's another factoid for you. There are actually 2 rings per year. And somebody can correct me, but if I remember correctly, the widest part, this lighter part, this is where the tree grew during the late spring, the summer, and the early fall. The dark ring is where there was some kind of little bit of growth over the winter. So you count the whole thing as one ring unit for this. And this one, a coarse grain, this is much more of a packed grain, tighter grain structure that we want to see. Now this particular piece of wood is not very desirable because you can see it's got a split right here. That split continues through the wood here, and this would actually split along one of these growth rings. This is why, sometimes this isn't such a desirable thing, but where these little ridges are, these were the knots that were covered up. So this particular piece of wood illustrates what we're looking for, more of what we're looking for, but still had some issues. So, dimension lumber, boards. Here's a knot that you can see very well. This again, the heart of the wood right here. But if you look at this closer, this one grew a lot, and then the rings got packed. One of the things that ring scientists look for, here we go. One of the things that tree ring scientists look for, and again this one, here's the heart of the wood right here, heart of the tree. We start working our way out. When the rings are fairly far apart, this tree is getting enough nutrients, water, sunlight. When the rings are becoming more packed together, something's happening here. It could be maybe it was a drought year, a little less water. Maybe there were more storms. Maybe it was colder for a longer part of the year. Out here at the very end, you can see where these are packed together quite tightly. So scientists use tree rings to talk to us about what climate has been like. And here again, this is another one. You can see this is from Idaho Forest Products, but the dead center of the tree, you can see where that crack goes right down the middle of where there's hardly any ring structure at all. And of course this split, and this line right here, this was the original little spindly tree trunk of the original seedling tree when it was growing. And in this one again, we can see how it grew for a while, and then it's generally went into more of a consistent growth the older it got. Okay, so the wood that's cut out of the center of the tree nowadays is something we really want to stay away from. We would like to have wood that doesn't have knots, that doesn't have splits in it. These are defects. These could lead to problems. And if you look down this one, you'll notice this has kind of a twist to it. This also happens when you cut it out of the heart of the tree, because when it dries, it wants to twist around that axis down the middle of the tree. So, boards, dimension lumber. This 4x4 is a dimension piece. Now, this 4x4 I'm going to talk about here, even though it's been outside and weathered, I want to bring something to your attention here. This particular specimen, here's the heart of the wood. But this particular tree was what we called quarter sawed, which means that the tree was actually cut down the middle and across the middle, and it was cut into 4 sections before it was processed into lumber. The idea there was no one piece is going to have the very heart of the tree, and if you look at the ring structure here, we get rings that kind of circle around and go diagonally, which helps give some more strength to the piece of the wood. All right, so there's common boards and dimension lumber. Let's talk about some of the manufactured pieces of wood. Of course, we know plywood. Plywood is simply that. If you look here, you can see 1, 2, 3 plies. The tree is actually put into a machine and it's peeled like an apple to get these plies or veneers. Now, this knot is a defect, and originally this would have been taken out and a plug put in, and you could still buy plywood like that. However, the thinking nowadays is that we're using plywood mainly to cover the inside of walls or floors or even on the ceiling, and do we really need to worry about a defect like this if it's going to be hidden by paint or stucco or some other kind of siding? But plywood gets its strength because the grain on this one goes this way on the top, it goes this way on the bottom, and in the middle, I don't know if you can see that color change, but in the middle, it's actually moving at a right angle to that. So that makes this very light, but yet very strong. This was developed in, I think, about the 19-teens, 1920s, and this came in very handy in World War II because you could ship a lot of building material. It was lightweight, but it was very easy to use. Next, we have this piece right here. This is called oriented strand board, or you'll hear this called OSB. And it's called OSB because if you look down the grain here, you'll notice that most of the flakes are all moving in the same general direction. Plus, if I pick this up, which I think I can do, if I pick this up and show you, unlike plywood, there's no real layers to this. That's because all of these strands, when they fall down, they crisscross and overlap each other, and that gives this the strength. Oh, you're wondering about the lines, aren't you? Okay. Well, sheet material comes in 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. This material here has become the most popular material used in home construction in the United States today. The lines tell the carpenters where the studs and the framing is behind it. These lines, the first line here, from the edge of the board, where's my hand? I can't see my hand over here. There we go. From the edge of the board to the first line is 16 inches. In the United States, the standard spacing for studs in the wall, the framing, is 16 inches between boards. From here to here is 16. And then from there to the other end is 16. Excuse me, we're at the end of a very long day. Okay, the other 3 pieces that I have over here, I have a piece of, this is hardwood plywood. In this case, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers to this plywood, and this is made out of oak or maple, some hardwood. But it's very light, but it's also very easy to work with. This would be something if I wanted to build a nice tabletop or a nice bookcase, I would use this. And you can see that the color and the texture of the wood is different than the pine plywood. Pine is a softwood. Oh, the difference between soft and hardwoods? Softwood generally comes from what we call conifer trees. These are your pine trees, or any tree that has a needle or that has a cone. Hardwood, generally speaking, comes from what we call deciduous trees, or trees that lose their leaves in the wintertime. So we had OSB, we have plywood. This is a sheeting material for the outside. This is made of wood particles that have been blown in, mixed with glue under intense heat and pressure, and it's been formed into this board. And as you can see, it's just particles inside of here. This is an outside exterior sheeting material that you can buy, and this is used on the outside of a lot of house construction here in the United States. And then finally, this little piece of wood here, this is a sample of what we call paneling. It's one single veneer, you can see it right there, but it's got a contact cover put on the outside of it to give it some kind of grain and to give it some color. And then generally speaking, this is used for boxes, this is used to cover walls. It just depends on what you're doing. A lot of mobile home construction will use paneling like this because it's very lightweight. Okay. Hopefully this helps with your understanding where lumber comes from and how we select and some of the different defects. I've tried to keep this very simple. A lot of the videos out there can get very complicated and they can go into a great deal of detail. I wanted to keep it simple because when I walk into my local big box store like Home Depot or Lowe's, or even my local hardware store like Cardinal Hardware here in Eunice, I know what I'm looking for. Most people have an accepted common language, you know, OSB, plywood, sheeting, paneling, dimension lumber, boards are considered to be the really flat stuff. Bigger dimension lumber like the 4x4. And if you understand the basics, you can have a conversation and find the pieces of wood that you need for your project. Also, by understanding some of the defects and what to look for, you can get wood that will last forever. One last thing about all of this wood here. The older it gets, the drier it gets, the stronger it gets. Unless it's exposed to some kind of bacteria or rot or insect damage, wood becomes stronger the older it gets, and properly done, wood construction will last hundreds of years. Just look at some of the older houses in the Northeast United States, England, and Europe. Properly done will last for basically forever in the course of the life of a human being. All right, hopefully you've learned something, and we will see you at the next video.